For the last 31 years, the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, has been bringing together an unprecedented mix of global, political, and business leaders. For the first time in its history, the forum will hold its annual meeting not in Davos, but in New York City. Klaus Schwab is the founder and president of the World Economic Forum. I'm pleased to have him at this table. You have announced that you're going to take the, what's now called Davos, the World Economic Forum, to New York City. Why?
I think it's very symbolic. When you, for several reasons. First, it's an act of solidarity. This city and the American people have had such a tremendous tragedy to suffer, and I feel the world has to be behind them. But there's much more behind it. When I came back, and of course very much influenced by what I have seen, we decided that we should adapt our program. And it was clear that the 11th of September in some way created a new chapter in history. And when we look forward, nobody really knows how this chapter will look like. We have certain ideas. Of course, we are fighting now under the leadership of the president and the coalition. We are fighting terrorism. But there are so many other aspects. So we thought we should take an integrated view, and we should try to develop a long-term vision. How will the world look like in the coming years?
So almost as quick as you had to decide about a new place for the venue, a new venue for the forum, you also had to decide what your new subject matter was.
Exactly. We revamped completely the program. We sat down, we looked at the different facets of the global agenda, and then we felt the most appropriate place to deal with those issues is New York. And of course there are even more reasons. New York is a multicultural city. It's a symbol for a global community in some way. So we had, of course, certain doubts, certain question marks, but we took the decision, and now it's clear it was the right decision to take.
Mayor Giuliani was receptive and open and encouraging?
Immediately, as was the governor, as were the federal authorities.
What worries do you have?
In the program, actually...
That brings together so many heads of state.
Yes, from an operational point of view, we don't have worries. I think we are in good hands, we have excellent cooperation. But, of course, it's a different setting. Here, they are much more mingling among people, and there's much more interactions. They will stay here, not behind closed doors, but they have to meet the other stakeholders, business, NGOs, and so on. So, from an operational point of view, I think we will have a great meeting. What worries me is to make sure that we have an outcome and a result and a message which really shows that we can look with confidence into our future.
What the subject matter will be, what is the new age, and how do we advance, and what are the important ideas, and what are the interesting solutions to the new challenge, I assume, some variation of that.
We have to look at all those in a integrated, in a systemic view. And there are mainly 4 topics and 4 areas we are looking at. The first one is the economic situation. How do we fight recession? I think we will see next January we are at a very crucial moment. That's the number one, no, not the most, all are of same importance, but that's the number one issue. The second issue is how do we address the reasons or some of the reasons for terrorism? How do we alleviate poverty? How do we create a situation where we have less divides in the world? The third area is the dialogue among cultures. How do we create better understanding for our global neighbors? And the fourth, of course, most important, what can the other stakeholders, not only the political authorities, governments, but what can business, NGOs do in order to fight terrorism?
Now, what do you say to those people who are watching this conversation and they'll say, I sort of know there's something called Davos, and I see these newspaper stories, and CNN is there, and CNBC is there, and the network covering, and Bloomberg is there, and I know Klaus Schwab created this, but I don't quite know what the World Economic Forum is, other than sort of a giant place where important people, some say elitist, come together to network, to share ideas, to meet each other, to talk to each other in one confined space. What's the purpose? And has it evolved in recent time to new objectives? Not subject matter, but what you hope to accomplish.
I think the basic purpose is that we are a multi-stakeholder platform, what is absolutely needed in the world. If you look at the big challenges on the global agenda, being it global warming, being it terrorism, and so on, they cannot be met by governments alone, or by business alone, or by NGOs alone, or by scientists and experts alone. What we really need are collaborative efforts. And the World Economic Forum is a framework to create those collaborative efforts. So it's not just the meeting, it's also the process in order to come to an outcome. So we spend a lot of time to prepare by task forces and so on, the meeting itself.
What does it do? Go ahead, let me continue. But what does it do different, say, than the United Nations might do? That any one of several international organizations that bring people together do?
The United Nations is a governmental organization. The World Economic Forum, I would say, is a private organization with a public purpose. So we are really a multi-stakeholder platform. The UN is an organization of governments. So we supplement and we can help the United Nations. We do not want to take over from the United Nations, but we want to make the work of the United Nations and of the government easier by, let's say, rallying the other stakeholders behind the governments and the governmental objectives.
This thing started out as a one-time event?
It started
20,
out
30, how many years ago?
32 years ago.
32
years ago. It started out, I had done my studies in Europe and partially here at Harvard, and I met, by the way, at that time, I met for the first time Henry Kissinger. And I felt what the world needs is a platform between business and governments. That was the original idea.
That has grown to include all these other things that we've been talking about.
Exactly.
Why were, last year in Davos, what is it about the World Economic Forum that seems to draw the ire of the groups that were protesting at Seattle and in Washington?
I think it's a misunderstanding because contrary to those groups, we are not an official organization and we actually deal with the concerns. The Forum has a long history of integrating critical voices, integrating NGOs. In the 70s, I think we were the first organization inviting Ralph Nader, just to give you an example. That was in the 70s. So we have a long history. We had last year in Davos, we had about 50 NGOs, all the big global NGOs like Amnesty International, Greenpeace and so on. We had in the Congress House, and we had them in the Congress House as real discussion partners. But what we have seen in Davos this year, there are, of course, many more. There are particularly what is called in Switzerland black blocs, people who refuse the dialogue.
Right.
And those were mainly on the streets.
Yeah, and therefore, if you refuse a dialogue, you get more attention if there is some kind of clash.
Exactly. And what my foreign friends usually do not understand, we have in Switzerland a union of journalists, and the union of journalists was the organization which asked for the manifestation. So actually the demonstration was organized by the Swiss Union of Journalists. So journalists of whom you normally expect that they would report on an issue created themselves the event, if I may say so.
Before September the 11th, as you know, there was concern about the downturn in many parts of the world and a hope for a revival of positive development. On September the 11th, I think that all the confidence that many of us had was at least arrested momentarily, and without any doubt the consumer has been affected, and this in turn has affected economic growth throughout the world.
And let's just talk about specific in terms of numbers. As I understand it, you are suggesting that there will be maybe a 1 to 1.25 decrease in economic growth.
Well, that would be true in the developed countries, and in the developing countries still significant and somewhat less. A lot will depend, of course, since I'm not a foreseer of the future, on what happens politically in the coming weeks and months. I think the positive thing that's happened since September the 11th is the way global monetary policies come together. But I think everybody would say that September the 11th has arrested the return to confidence.
Arrested the return to confidence.
I would say so. I mean, it comes through for all of us as individuals. We're concerned about what is going to happen in the near future in terms of the market, in terms of decisions to invest, in terms of our willingness to take additional risk. And that is coming through in the international markets and affecting particularly the developing countries, because in those countries you have a high incidence of poverty, and even small downturns impact the things such as how quickly people get out of poverty and have a direct impact on how many children die in the course of any year. So we, of course, as the bank, are very, very concerned with the impact on the poorest peoples.
I just saw a number today, I think, that said 40,000 more children under the age of 5 will die because of the aftermath of this.
Well, that's a pretty fair estimate. It's work that was once done actually by Larry Summers, and economically it makes sense. And if you get a reduction in economic activity, it passes straight through to the poorer sectors of the community, and somewhere between 20 and 40,000 children under the age of 5 will die as a result of the economic downturn.
It should be said, out of credit to you, without flattering you too much, that you know, while the World Bank and IMF have been buffeted by lots of protest and some criticism across the board, that what clearly has happened, and you have, I'm not sure, gotten sufficient attention for this, is try to steer the World Bank more towards dealing with issues of world poverty. And this was before September 11th, and I assume that the imperative to do more now is even stronger.
Well, Charlie, it's nice of you to say that. I think I and my colleagues have really given a focus to this issue of poverty, because what we've learned since September the 11th, if anyone doubted it beforehand, is that we have really only one world. There isn't a wall around the United States or any of the developed countries. And therefore, the issue of poverty around the world is very much the issue of peace. If you have inequity on a global scale, if you have people that are dissatisfied and that are unhappy, these are the breeding grounds for discontent. Poverty is not, of course, directly related to the tragedy in the World Trade Center and in the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania, but you would have to say that the closest link that one can find in terms of peace is the combating of poverty, and that's something to which we are directly addressing ourselves.
So you're suggesting, I assume, that after dealing with the issue of terrorism and the immediacy of that in terms of whatever deterrent you can initiate in terms of governments, the second most important thing is to get at the issues which are breeding grounds for discontent.
Well, I think that's absolutely clear. I mean, taking action in Afghanistan or dealing in some of the nearby countries will undoubtedly lead to a reduction in terror, and if we're successful in maybe eradicating it. But unless you deal with the underlying causes of discontent, whether it be in Central Asia or the Middle East or in Africa, you cannot be assured of peaceful development. And so for me, fighting terror and terrorism is step one. Economic development and fighting poverty is a necessary step two.
I don't see how anyone can resist the notion that it's our duty and our responsibility to create the conditions so that life can be fulfilling and meaningful for every human being. And it doesn't stop at the water's edge. It's something we should work on in a broader sense. For sure we need to work on it inside the United States, make it a reality here. But we have an obligation, I think, and an opportunity to make our time a time that matters and not just a time of saying grace over the institutions as we found them.
What kind of economic model do you believe in?
A free market with a human face. And that is, today it is able to combine the management of the economy, where you attract foreign investment, where you create the legal, political, and economic stability to attract foreign and private investment. But the aim is that the benefits of that investment, that the priority of the government is to invest in health and education. I would not have been over here in front of you today if it wouldn't have been for education.
So education is the means
Education
to change a country,
health
to put the
and
power
education,
in the hands of the people.
particularly in a world where no longer a country is viable or competitive because it has gold, silver, copper, oil, gas. It will depend a lot how courageous governments are to reprioritize public investment and reorient it towards health and education.
You have made a significant contribution in the fight against AIDS in Africa. You have funded, to a large degree, vaccines and vaccine research. Give me a sense of where that's directed and what success you think we're making, and your own particular interest in public health in the world.
Well, this is a real passion for me, so I'll give a succinct answer. People, I think, don't have a full awareness how 4 billion of the 6 billion people on this planet don't have basic health needs met. The death rate of infants, the epidemic infectious diseases that are just a way of life in most of the world don't exist in the developed world. And yet the research isn't going on for the medicines that would get rid of these diseases. Even diseases like tuberculosis, where for a few $100s lives can be saved, that's not being done. Vaccines aren't being moved from the rich world to the poor world. AIDS is the most extreme, where the prevention measures that could prevent this from becoming a huge epidemic in countries like India, Nigeria, and many countries where it's not in huge percentages
Hasn't
today.
reached the proportions of Africa.
The right things, I think, are not being prioritized. So the foundation that my wife and I have taken as its top priority these world health issues, the research, getting the vaccines out, and it's been fascinating to learn about this and to try and say that all these lives, the lives all over the world, should be treated with the same value that we treat lives here in the rich world.
So just to sum up, in a sense, I mean, what you have learned from your own involvement, from funding it in terms of more money than had ever been applied, is that it can make a difference.
Absolutely. Millions of lives can be and should be saved through these efforts. And we can make a difference, and we can encourage others to get involved.
That was my last question. Is that happening as you fund these efforts? Is it becoming a kind of wedge that other governments and other foundations and other sources are following suit or matching?
Yeah, we've seen a good start, I would say. The vaccine fund we put together, we put in $750 million now. Governments have agreed to put up $500 million in addition to that. In the AIDS area, some of the things we've backed have been able to attract additional money. Having said that, this is a cause that somehow deserves more visibility, because when you talk to people about this and they hear about malaria or AIDS, they really do care and they think their government's doing more. And so, you know, when I'm not working, a lot of my creativity is going into what could be done to show people that their money would be well spent, it would make a difference, and, you know, try and make sure that world health gets more priority.
How has this changed you?
Well, I came into this job more as a scientist, someone with an academic background, although I'd been working in the field in Africa for many years. Epidemics, Ebola virus, and so on. And I've always been fascinated by the link between, let's say, poverty, the social context, and diseases. And I saw this as an opportunity to translate that into some action. But what has changed me is that I now firmly believe that political action is as important as laboratory research on and to develop a vaccine, for example, which is also necessary. So I've become a bit perhaps less naive. Before I used to think that if you've got the facts right, the action will follow, resources will be there. So, you know, this kind of data for decision. I know today that decisions are not made on facts, but on a whole set of arguments, and you've got to use the right arguments depending on who you want to influence.
In the end, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic, otherwise I wouldn't be in this job. I wouldn't...
Couldn't continue.
I couldn't continue. Also...
Optimistic that the world is coming to recognize the threat and that it would be a moral tragedy of immense dimension not to act.
Right. I mean, it's optimistic for two reasons. The first one is, and I think is a very important one, and that is that we've got very well documented evidence that education, that mobilization of communities, that works, and that when you take a country like Uganda, Zambia, Thailand, Senegal, today they've got less infections than 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Because they did what?
Because there was strong leadership, recognition of the problem, mobilization of a whole country, talking about sex, promoting condoms, making people aware, organize widespread testing and counseling on a voluntary basis. I mean, it's a mixture of interventions, and that works. And that, I think, is extremely important. And then the second reason I'm optimistic is what you referred to, and because there is a new awareness here. There's really a breaking of the silence. What made me really sometimes angry was that people wouldn't recognize that AIDS is such a problem in the society when people are dying around them. And that is finished. Today there is this recognition in the countries, in Africa, in Asia, but also more and more in the West.
How do you use your leverage? How do you make a difference yourself?
I don't know. I mean, I appreciate the absurdity, indeed, sometimes the obscenity of celebrities, you know, talking, you know, with a cause. You know, there is something obscene about it. You know, poverty next to, you know, such a kind of spoiled life, I suppose. But still, I'm ready for the pratfalls. I just feel it's part of who we are as a band, and U2. And maybe it's an Irish thing. You know, we're always mixed it up. Irish people go to any bar, and they're, you know,
into politics.
They're just going off.
Yeah. And
we do go off. But also, you have to be savvy and smart about these things. Sometimes it takes a picture of a pontiff and a pop star to get people talking, because debt cancellation, which is what I've been working on for the last few years, you know, where we're trying to cancel the you know, these old debts owed by the poorest countries on the planet to the richest. That was not a sexy subject. That was a hard melody line for people to follow. And so we had to, you know, we had to do some, you know, we had to mix it up.
How much of this is because of where you're from?
I think maybe a lot of it. In Ireland.
Dublin shaped you that way.
I think probably, you know, Irish people, whether it's folk memory or not, if there is such a thing. I do think that Irish people have, for instance, a sense of they understand the concept of famine, you know, obviously. I mean, there's, in 1850, you had a population of 8 million on our island. And 5 years later, you had 4 million. 2 million died and 2 million left. A lot of them are here in the United States. It's more Irish people here than at home. So it's in the air, you know. And all those people didn't have to die. It was bureaucracy, actually, that stopped it. So Irish people really have no time for bureaucracy. And I think, you know, there's a lot of support there at home and maybe some extra understanding.
How did you get involved in debt reduction? Which you know, we've had lots of conversations here with different politicians, but you're the only entertainer.
Yeah.
Musician.
I was really, I got a call a few years back. Myself and my wife Elie had spent some time in Africa around about the time of Live Aid.
Yeah.
And We Are the World thing, you remember all that?
Oh, sure.
And we went out afterwards and we worked there for a month. Didn't tell anyone about it, just went out and did it. And we swore, we promised ourselves that we wouldn't forget our experience. It affected us at a very deep level. But we did forget about it. You know, you get on with your day and your business at hand. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I had a feeling that one day I'd like to get at the structure of this poverty. Not to just be throwing pennies at the problem, but, you know, not philanthropy. Get actually into the structure of it. So when I heard about this idea of cancelling the debts of the poorest countries on the planet to the richest, as part of the Millennium celebrations, I thought, okay, that's an idea. Yeah. That's a melody line I can follow.
Yeah, what's interesting about this, I don't know where it comes from you, but what's interesting about it for me is that this is not, I mean, this is not a sexy issue.
No.
It's an important issue, but not a sexy issue.
No.
I mean, it's not even it's a powerful issue, but it doesn't have the emotional, not sexy, but emotional pull that Pinochet is, because you're talking about people there who you know, who people know, who come and they the people that they talk about who were killed during that regime, you know, are living, breathing relatives of the dead.
Those numbers.
Whereas debt reduction doesn't have that.
Those numbers are affecting real lives. I mean, when I found out that for every $1 in government aid to sub-Saharan Africa, they return 9, okay, in servicing their old debts. You tell that to people on the streets here in the United States, and they get angry.
I think we're at a period that is very similar to the period 1945 to 1950. At that time, President Truman took a country that had been historically isolationist.
America,
took the United States, historically isolationist, and committed it to a more or less lasting engagement in the Cold War, what became the Cold War, in the confrontation with the Soviet Union, which was not an easy decision at the time.
Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, all of that.
And he created the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and NATO, the whole structure of international relations. Now we are at the beginning of the 21st century. We have an entirely new threat, much less tangible, much less focused on a specific nation, but in many ways, in its immediate impact, even more deadly. And the United States has an opportunity to create, this administration has an opportunity to create a system of order for the international system and a new arrangement of international alignments that will serve us for the next generation.
This is an enormously strong and resilient country which has faced challenges of monumental proportions before. The world now is watching us as to how we will respond to this. There should be no question, number one, that everyone will be united behind the president. There should be no question, number two, of our resoluteness. But while I think the landscape of international terrorism has changed. We cannot let this corrode the fabric of American society, or the people who did that today prevail. And so while there are a whole series of things that have to be done in terms of security, in terms of precaution, in terms of intelligence, in terms of a strategy for dealing with this, we cannot let fear become the dominant, self-fulfilling prophecy here, which dictates how we live.
This is a very critical period, and people will be, and historians will say that there is a pre-11th of September history and there's a post-11th of September history. Now, what that history will be is in the making right now, in the decisions we make, the United States makes, the NATO makes, we as allies make together. It's going to be a different world, and I think we all have this need not only to come and express our solidarity, which I did, and our strong condemnation and our will to work together, but also to exchange views. And I came also from Moscow, Berlin, and Brussels, bringing some information from my side. We're in a region in Greece, in the Balkans, near the Middle East, where we think that these regional problems, maybe, if you like, there is some silver lining to this tragedy, that maybe we can get a grip on some of these problems and move them forward, and maybe it should be a priority also if we really want to get a wider world alliance against terrorism.
Did you feel during this time, when New York and your primary concern had to be for the citizens of this state that you represent?
That's right.
Were there any times that you felt, look, I don't want to make sure if there's anybody who has some edge about me, I want to sort of be quieter. I want to let other people take the lead, because what's important here is to see that New York, without anybody, whatever reason, basing it on any other factor other than the right thing and need.
Absolutely.
You did that?
Oh, my duty is to the people of New York. I have no higher duty than to do everything I can to bring about the results that will help people. And I don't need credit. I don't need any more publicity. I don't need any of that.
No, you don't.
And what I have found is that really is how everybody's behaving. I mean, people are so united in our common desire to help in any way we can that there's almost a natural division of responsibility and labor. When we were working for the $20 billion, Senator Schumer and I worked on our congressional leadership, and we were on the phone with the mayor and the governor so that they would call the White House, or they would call a Republican member that they had a relationship with. And it was just all this great team. We would go where we thought we could be most useful and kind of pull back where we didn't think we would be, and it worked. It all fell into place.
Do you feel comfortable now, though, that you have settled into, because this accelerates everything? Everything.
Yeah.
That you sense that I am the junior senator from New York.
I am.
Yeah.
That was to be, as I've heard people say, a true fact.
Yes. I mean, you all of a sudden, you sort of go along doing your job, then you wake up and you say,
oh my gosh,
I'm the senator.
Yeah.
And it's natural and instinctive, and as
Right.
it is for me to be on television every night.
Right.
It's just
You've been at it a little longer
well,
than I have.
as long as you've been a senator, yeah.
But
you know what I mean?
I do, absolutely.
And all of a sudden you're walking through the paces and you're trying to make relationships, and all of a sudden,
Right.
and all of a sudden you feel a sense of, it's a breakthrough.
It is. Well, I don't think I slept much for the first 2 weeks after this. I was, I was so focused on trying to make sure I did everything I could think of to do, that I saw as many people as I could see, that I not only visited the site, but visited with my colleagues to help convey it to them, because until I saw it for myself, I didn't realize what a difference the personal experience made. So trying to get people to come and see it, going to the family center, visiting with a lot of the family members. So the amount of just sheer work that was required in the wake of this was overwhelming. But kind of jumping totally into it and working as many hours as I could keep my eyes open, made it really possible for me to immerse myself in what needed to be done. And out of it, I feel very comfortable with, where I am, with the kind of support and relationships that I have built up, all of which, I'm going to try to use to help people in New York. And so it's been a really challenging couple of weeks. But when I think about what people are going through,
it's nothing.
The hardship and the heartbreak, it's nothing. It's really nothing. And I think a lot of us feel that way.
I know, so I'm asleep, so I'm tired,
yeah,
so I'm what? Who cares?
Who cares? It's so minor compared to the suffering that has taken place.
Beyond a sense of context and perspective, what else has it changed? Has it changed any way you think about your own future? Has it changed the way you think about your child's future, your husband's future, any of that?
I haven't really stopped to think about that. I think, like so many people, it has reinforced what's really important. The relationships that are at the core of who you are and what you care about. I find myself, and this is just a tiny little thing, but when I'm at the Senate and I have to go from my office to the Capitol to vote, I like to walk outside instead of underground. I just want to see the sky. I want to see that Capitol dome. It is a recognition of how precious life is, and
it sure is that.
And we shouldn't have to be reminded of it, but unfortunately, in our pace of life, we often do.
France has been seen as a very close country, looking first to Franco-French issue. I think that, but as many young leaders in France, I'm much more global and open, and I think that France is strong enough to take chance outside instead of protecting itself against the outside. From that point of view, perhaps I'm more global. I'm more in love with the US than many French people. So that's perhaps what I've been called un-French, but
are young French business people like you, do they represent a very distinct mindset than equivalent French political leaders who are in positions of power in France? Are you different in mindset than they are?
I think that, yes. It's fair to say that the business generation is more global, or has become more quickly global than the political class in France. It's changing. It's changing. And euros will help, because now even when you are a French minister or a French government, you cannot deal only with Franco-French issues. You have to look to Europe. That's already a big piece. And from Europe, you have to look to global issues. And I do think that's one of the quote-unquote benefits of the horrors of 9/11 events, is that it did strengthen the links between France and US. Because we all understand in France what's fighting against terrorism means. And I think that this new world, post 9/11, will also help France to look just outside.
In the Middle East, there is, to me, I think to many, this fascinating combination of things that are familiar and things that are different. I mean, Islam, for example, as a religion, has far more in common with Christianity and Judaism than it has with the religions of India or China. And there is a sense in which the real frontier is not the western frontier of Islam, the eastern frontier of Islam. East of that frontier, you have the civilizations of India, China, etc. West of that frontier, you have Muslims, Christians, and Jews, who are all sub-variants of one great religious tradition. The long unending wars between Islam and Christendom, from the early Middle Ages through the Crusades and onwards, I think these wars were motivated not by their differences, but by their resemblances.
Yeah. And it's also the foundation, I mean, it is, in a sense, the crucible for so many, such deep religious feeling.
Exactly. And it also has such an important ongoing relationship with the West.
sometimes hostile, but by no means always hostile. In the Middle Ages, when the great centers of learning were in the Arab Muslim world, which at that time included Sicily and Spain, young men from England and France and Germany used to go to Arab universities in Sicily and Spain in order to acquire the more advanced science of the time, just as young men from those places now come to the West to acquire the more advanced science of the time.
Are you saying that you think the great question has to do with the conflict within Islam rather than a conflict between Islam and the rest of the world?
It's a conflict first within Islam, you know. And what we are witnessing now is a big change not only in Islam, but I would say in Muslim societies. Until recently, usually Muslims have had the majority in one country. So you could say that Turkey is a Muslim country, Iran is a Muslim country. Now what we see is the westernization of Islam. Islam is in the West, but as a minority. Yes. And the fact to live as a minority, of course, changes your mind. And among the fringe of Muslims living in the West, there is a radicalization, breaking, rupture with not only, you know, the country of origin, but also their families, their traditions, and the host country.
For too long, we in the Arab and Muslim world have tried to dump our problems on the external world, in particular on the West and the United States. Unfortunately, for too long, the intellectual and political establishment has refused to take personal and moral responsibility for the inherent authoritarianism and patriarchy which are deeply embedded in the Arab social fabric. I think it's about time that the Arab and the Muslim intellectual and political establishment take a personal and moral responsibility and face the problems, the internal problems head on, and to fully join modernity, embrace modernity fully, without qualifications, without linking this quest to join modernity to imperialism, past grievances against imperialism, colonialism, globalization, and other destructive isms.
Tell me how you feel about the way this world is going through this historic time.
Well, I think I'm looking at it not unlike my husband would have looked at it, with a great deal of pain and grief, but also, as has been also mentioned by many here in the United States, as a moment, a pivotal, perhaps, moment of history and of opportunity for people as individuals, as cultural and national groups, as well as regional and even global, if you will, perhaps solidarity and cooperation on levels and in contexts that we haven't seen for a very long time. So I am hopeful, and I also very conscious, as I think we all are, of how much work needs to be done, how nothing can be taken for granted at this time, and yet that there is a reservoir of, I think, thought and determination and perhaps greater resilience on the part of many who wouldn't have imagined possibly what is developing today in the way of a coalition that perhaps, you know, a political coalition, perhaps taking other dimensions, but also in terms of a moral and cross-cultural interfaith coalition.
It really seems that way. I mean, people come here and say they think that, you know, history is now divided between before September 11th and afterwards. It is one of those pivotal moments, you know. And we seem to be escaping, and because of so many people that are speaking out, especially people of Islam and the Muslim faith, like you, to make distinctions and to speak on behalf of experience in the West and experience in the East and experience as Muslims, to make sure that no one is allowed to view the act of extremism to be reflection or assumed to have anything to do with any kind of conflict that involves either the West or Islam.
Absolutely. It is not about ethnicity or faith, what has taken place, but it's about fanaticism, and it's about reflected ignorance and fear and deprivation, insecurity, and not any faith or culture. It targeted innocent Americans and people of another 80 nationalities, including faiths. Muslims and Arab Americans and Arabs, and as you said, of probably all faiths.
It's amazing to me that we have done so much good in terms of the battle against disease and lots of other things in terms of stretching the capacity of human knowledge, the exploration of life in worlds beyond, and yet at the same time, we're doing terribly destructive to this planet.
And
we're also being terribly destructive of each other in terms of war.
And look, right now there's a threat of nuclear arms proliferation again, as countries are being told, go ahead, do your nuclear tests. And it's really frightening. So to me, it's terribly important that people, A, realize the fact that I don't know that we have that much time before life as we know it today is going to be, gone.
What's the biggest danger, you think?
I think the biggest danger is the rapid extinction of species, and that's coming along with the destruction of the environment.
We have no sense of that,
No.
If I walked outside on the streets of New York and said, what do you know about the rapid extinction of species? They'd say, what?
Yeah, we're facing the 6th great extinction, and that's discussed in this new PBS series on evolution. It's a very, very critical time that we face as these species vanish at such a fast rate. And of course, underlying all of this is human population growth. We're just spiraling out of control. And on the one hand, in some parts of the globe, we have tremendous destruction of the environment because of the numbers of people living there. And on the other part of the globe, we have terrible overconsumption of people using, taking, buying greedily more than they need.
So
more than they
So
need.
what drives you?
So what drives me is I want to get a message across, not only to youth, but to adults as well, that we have to change our ways. It's desperately important. But the message, too, that there certainly is hope if we take action now. And I think that's the message people are flocking to hear.
That there is hope if we act.
That there's hope if we act. And people are desperate. What can I do? What can I do? And I mean, it's a very simple, those of us fortunate enough to live in the wealthier parts of society, like you and me, we have this huge power to make ethical choices in what we buy. There's nobody forcing us to buy products tested on animals, products made by industries, businesses that are not friendly to the environment or society. We don't have to buy genetically modified food. We can search for organic food, and so on and so on and so on. And if
you don't
we
think
do
any
that,
genetically modified food is good?
No, I don't.
None.
I wouldn't say none. I don't know possibly enough about it to say none. But by and large,
no,
I mean,
you will get a debate on that, as you know.
Of course, but it's filled with toxin. The toxins that kill the insects that would eat it. You know, when the roots and stuff in the plant go back into the ground, the toxins are going into the ground. And how can that possibly be good? And you know something, Charlie, but it took 30 years to discover that the long-term cumulative effects of DDT, hailed as a wonder chemical, was so terribly damaging to the environment.
Who was that, Rachel Carson? Who did that?
Rachel Carson, yeah. And then CFCs, the same thing, but we're still doing it. It's still going out there. And the pollution is, in some places, I mean, the children that we love, that we bring into the world, their bodies are being poisoned by the water they drink, by the food that they eat, by the air that they breathe.
Tolerance, understanding, coexistence in diversity is a very modern and a very limited kind of philosophy, you know. It's still, you know, the patrimony of a very small group of nations. I think if we look to the whole world, you know, what we have is that the civilization, in the sense of coexistence in diversity, tolerance for different religions, for different ideas, for different customs, is still very small in a world in which the traditional intolerance, you know...
There's more intolerance than tolerance?
I think so. statistically, without any doubt. And this is, I think, the big challenge in the near future, to promote this idea of tolerance, which is the idea of civilization, democratic values
and
all
dialogue.
over the world. Yeah, dialogue and coexistence in diversity. No? And
are you hopeful?
I think it's possible.
We may have.
I think we have improved. You know,
yeah, and perhaps turned a corner because of the tragedy and the. I mean, what happened on September 11th was so visible.
Yes.
And seen.
Yes.
I mean, we've had terrorism for a long time, as you say. But even in contemporary times in different countries, whether it was assassination of political leaders or whatever it wasn't as visible, you know, and so clear as it was on September 11th.
Well, I think this is probably the only positive sequel of the tragedy of the 11th of September.
And the victims were of all nations and all religions and all backgrounds.
Yeah.
So therefore, it wasn't just directed against one political leader, which makes it different and makes it a rallying cry, I assume, for all the nations.
Yeah. But after the 11th of September, I think there is a clear consciousness in the world that terrorism is not a limited, you know, problem, but it's a major problem and probably the first priority for democratic countries, for civilization to face.
We as human beings who live in a certain century, which is a good century, I was, you know, I was so optimistic at the beginning of the century. I thought really it was good. The century begins again, a new one. Now we have time to think about it, to take a deep breath and say, all right, we shall never do what has been done by others a century ago. And here we are, hardly 2 years. And once more, we are stunned into silence. Stunned by the crime, by the absurdity of the crime.
And the essence of being human is the recognition that my humanity is bound up with your humanity. That if I were to dehumanize you inexorably, I am diminished too as a person. And it says we are made, in fact, for togetherness, for interdependence. We say in our languages, a person is a person through other persons. I am because you are. I am because I belong. And this harmony is such a crucial thing that when you nurse a hurt, when you constantly brooding, this is corrosive. And so anger and resentment are things that you have got to try to get rid of because they are destructive of what is so essential, the commonality of our togetherness.
Some of the subjects and some of the people participating in the World Economic Forum here in New York this weekend. Thank you for joining us. Tomorrow night, Kirk Varnedoe. He is one of the great historians and experts on modern art. He is leaving his position at the Museum of Modern Art to go to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. We'll have a conversation about an interesting life and great art. See you tomorrow night.